Hey everybody. This video is going to cover the first essay that you were asked to read in the week 7 lesson on arguing cause. There's an exercise in there with 3 sample essays that you were asked to read and answer some questions about. So we're going to discuss the first of those essays in this video. So that first essay was No Sex Please, We're Middle Class. Very interesting read. But the first question that you were asked to answer is, what is Palia's main claim and how does her line of reasoning support the claim? Well, I think her main claim is that women's libido doesn't have a medical cause. They're low libido, or the apparently low libido of American women, that their low libidos are not caused by medical issues, but instead stems from the anxious, overachieving white upper middle class. It's a pretty harsh condemnation right there. So that is her claim, that because she starts off talking about how there was a potential female version of Viagra, and it did not get approved, but was highly suggested that more research be done, indicating that that we want something that is the equivalent of a female Viagra. This particular version was not quite it, but do more research because we want to get to one. We want to find one. And she's saying, well, okay, that's great, but I'm here to tell you that a pill isn't going to do anything to fix the real problem. That, a low libido for women right now has nothing to do with anything medical. A pill is not going to fix it. She's saying that it stems from white upper middle class values. And her line of reasoning is she starts us off going back to like the 19th century, the Victorian era, and how respectability became what people valued. That's what you were supposed to embody. And so that's when everything, we kind of went back to the puritanical times almost. So everything got very closed off, you weren't supposed to wear any revealing clothing. I mean, this is when a lot of really weird stuff happened in history. Like, for instance, when we talk about eating chicken or turkey, we always refer to white meat and dark meat. And I suppose a lot of people could think that there might be a racial implication there, has something to do with race or skin color, but it doesn't. It's actually because the dark meat typically comes from the thigh, right? And the white meat is, of course, the breast. And during the 19th century, we couldn't bring attention. We could not call attention to those body parts. You could not say breast. You could not say thigh, because if men heard those words, they'd go out of their minds with lust and women would all be in danger. So they started referring to them as something different. So white meat and dark meat. This is also when if you think back to how women dressed, they were in dresses, but they were completely covered from like neck to toe. You showed no skin, if you were respectable. Even things like pianos, okay? Pianos would have these covers over them that would go all the way down to the ground so that you couldn't see the legs of the piano. Again, because the shape of the piano legs might cause men to think about the shape of women's legs, and then the lust and the blah, blah, blah. It's crazy, right? So that's where she starts us off, is that very strict, repressed cultural phenomenon that happened during the 19th century when respectability became the number one thing that you were supposed to embody. It's what we valued most. And, it was interrupted briefly in the Roaring Twenties when jazz and liquor and flapper dancers kind of took America by storm, or at least parts of America. But then, we kind of went back to normal by the 1950s. And that's where we've kind of remained in a lot of ways. We did sort of have, the hippie movement, um, the free love movement, and she kind of touches on that in a little bit later. But for the most part, once we got past the Roaring Twenties, by the 50s, we had kind of gone back to that norm of being more respectable and being a little more repressed. Maybe not quite as extreme as it was in the 19th century, but still, we reined it in after the Roaring Twenties. So that's where we've been. She says that the white collar world, so upper middle class, have men and women performing the same kind of work, so there's no distinction between the two anymore. They're too familiar. Family life sees men as mere cogs. Women have sort of become the boss in a way. They're in charge of the kids and keeping the schedule and transporting them, and it's very hard work. And so you're kind of seriously in like beast mode. And it's not easy to just suddenly switch gears and become sexy wife again when you have the opportunity to have time with your spouse. All right. She goes, and then her next step is that, and on top of that, American men really aren't giving us very much to be attracted to, because the way they're dressing, nowadays, the oversized shirts and things like that, they're basically, they're too casual. There's no mystery left. And she then goes on to say, her next step, that the power of sexuality has even waned in popular culture, right? Movies of the 70s were very steamy, very risque. And then video games, then it changed, and we started getting less and less of that. Video games simply started to objectify women in the 90s. And then the actresses in Hollywood, because those middle class values, we value efficient bodies over voluptuous bodies. Even actresses started, becoming leaner and leaner. She says something of a very scathing remark about Pilates owned bodies. And, so that basically they looked like teenage boys with breasts, as opposed to what is valued as beautiful and desirable in like Latino and African American culture. And she points out specifically Beyonce, Bootylicious, that's where that there's a stark difference there in what the kind of bodies, female bodies, that white middle class, upper middle class seem to value and find desirable, versus other cultures. And she then goes on to point out how Victoria's Secret, even though they're often in malls which cater to the upper middle class, they really are, their base is really more African American and more working class. She even then goes and she says even country music, still retains some of its raunchiness, but rock music has completely dropped the ball. Where it used to be, the hallmark of rock and roll was that it was too sexy, too sensual. I mean, if you think back to the Ed Sullivan Show and why they wouldn't show Elvis below the waist, like it has lost that. That's how rock originated, but then generation after generation, it has just become more about the guitar and not about that essence that was there originally. We had some hope in the 80s with the female rockers, but even Madonna went bourgeois on us and got all lean and thin and tone and lost pretty much any sexuality that she exuded, especially during the first decade or two of her career. So that's her line of reasoning. She takes us from Victorian 19th century values and shows how things have progressed to where they are now. And where they are now is, you know, women possibly have low libidos because of all of these chain reactions that have happened throughout the last century. Right. Um, the next question says, is she doing more than arguing cause? Is she making subtle judgments or claims of value about the cause of women's decreased libido? And then it says, point to specific passages where she condemns, even in subtle terms, the lives of middle class women. I think it's most definitely a condemnation. She says things like that, when she talks about where our values started, she refers to it as Victorian prudery. She says there's been a loss of humorous sexual candor. She refers to the 50s as priggish. She laments, she's very sad about the loss of the liberated flappers from the 20s. So that period where we kind of got back to a little bit of sexuality, she thinks is good because it's sad that we lost the liberated flappers and went back to the priggish 50s. She says men must neuter themselves in the workplace, right? Because you can't, especially, and even now more so with the Me Too movement. She says androgyny because this is where she talks about how men and women are kind of performing the same roles. Women are making themselves less voluptuous. Men are making themselves less masculine in some ways, especially with the way they dress. Not necessarily how they really are, but just how they appear. She says androgyny can lead to stagnation and boredom. Those aren't good things. She says that the men and women are suffering from over familiarity, a curse of the mundane. Those aren't good things. They're definitely using language that implies negative emotions or negative opinions. That the actresses who have gone into Pilates overdrive, they are confusing sterile athleticism with female power. That's a bad thing. And then you can also see when she refers to Beyonce, the bootylicious Beyonce, that's a good thing. So it implies a condemnation of the white upper middle class. And then the whole last paragraph is pretty much a condemnation of the way upper white middle class women live. It's an interesting take on it, but she doesn't really hide how she feels. It's definitely there, and I think there is a judgment being made. She's not just, her main purpose in the essay is to offer a cause, an argument of cause, but those claims of value are definitely there within the argument of cause, right? The next question said, how do the allusions to rock music figure into her argument? What is their purpose? And what point or premise do they support? They support her premise that even pop culture has lost its sexuality, right? But the one thing rock music had going for it, in her eyes, was that over-sexualized, that over-sensualized nature that was kind of at its core when it first started, when the blues first, kind of took over, and all of the rock bands that were so heavily influenced by the blues. And she mentions the Rolling Stones in particular, and they were 100% influenced by American blues artists, even though they're British. And so it just kind of implies how big and how attractive blues music was, that even bands from England are being so heavily influenced by it. And, and Mick Jagger was definitely known for being so flamboyant and very sexual on stage when he performed. and they weren't the only band, but they're definitely one of the most popular, the most well known, and that, it was a wonderful time for rock music. And then the next generation looking at those bands, being influenced by those bands, they lost a little bit of the sexuality. And then the next generation lost even more until finally now today it's just all about the guitar gods. And it there's no more sex in it. Um, Maybe that left with the 80s with the hair bands, I'm not sure. It was definitely still there in the 80s, but they lost it, you know. How that supports her premise is rock music's biggest fan base comes from white upper middle class people. So if that's where a good chunk of the fan base is, it's a reflection of those values that she's saying has hindered women's libidos. It's just another sign of her premise, of her claim, right? The next question is, how does she engage the opposition? Um, she engages it a little earlier on when she's taking us through the timeline and talking about how we kind of reverted back to those Victorian era ways, interrupted briefly by the flappers during the 20s, but then by the 50s we had gone back to normal and we were a little more repressed again. We did have the 70s, but she mentions in paragraph 5 how the New Age movement, which kind of came out of the 60s and 70s and is still around today, they're the only ones that still kind of hang on to that sensual nature that used to be present in our culture. But so she's saying, yeah, okay, she's conceding there. You do have a point. There is a portion of our culture that still embraces those values and would still very much have more of a sensual energy coming from that group. But that's not where the power of American culture is. The power of American culture, how does she put it? She says, resides in America's careerist technocracy. That's where the majority of American culture exists, is in careerist technocracy. And so therefore that's where the upper white middle class values are in the careers and the technology and things like that. The New Age movement isn't big enough. It doesn't have enough power in American culture. So that was a concession and rebuttal, or a counter argument and rebuttal, however you want to look at it. The whole section I just talked about right before with rock music, that was actually counter argument as well, because right before that is when she says, places like Victoria's Secret are still booming. They're still very popular and selling a lot of product, which is, lingerie. So clearly, there's still a good bit of sexuality in our culture if they're doing so well, if women are still just eating their products up, and country music is still very sexualized in a lot of ways. So she's either expecting a counter argument or conceding a point there, like, yes, however, and then she counters with her own interpretation, which is the rock music point that she makes, because that's again where the power behind rock music is coming from upper white middle class Americans. So that's the bigger genre, I guess. So she points out a couple places, what the opposition might say, some points they might bring up. And I don't know that she really concedes. I think she counters. I don't think she gives anything to the opposition. I don't think she I don't think she believes they make a good point. I suppose you have to determine though who is the opposition, what is the opposing point of view. Um, the first opposing point of view she mentions right off the bat, the people that think that, you know, the decrease in women's libido can be cured with a pill. And she is absolutely saying no, it cannot. The other group that she might be addressing subtly in this are people who would think that white middle class, upper middle class values have nothing to do with the decrease in women's libido. I don't think she concedes anything to either party, to either group. I don't think she gives an inch at all. I think she is very steadfast in her interpretation of the cause, and she does address the opposition, but then she turns around and shoots them right down. She never really says that any opposing point of view is valid in any way. She doesn't directly address them either. It's much more subtle the way that she incorporates any mention of the opposition. But I think it's all counter argument and rebuttal. um, and then the last question is, what does she mean by a culture drained by middle class values? And why is such a phrase important to her argument? That is her argument. Her argument is that we are a culture drained by middle class values. And because of those values, sexuality has taken a, a very, very far away back seat in a lot of ways. Which is crazy to think about because there's still so much sex around us in the media, in music, movies, television, the internet. So I'd be interested to hear someone completely argue against her, because she doesn't seem to really address the sex that is still there. She really only points out the sex that's not there anymore. So that's one thing that I question when I read this essay. But that really is the core of her argument, is that women's libidos aren't very high anymore because they have been drained by all the things that the upper white middle class seem to value now. It does not allow for a thriving libido in women. It'd be interesting to get a man's perspective on it as well, how it affects men. Anyway, I think it's a very interesting read. It's a very good example of it is a very strong argument, whether we end up agreeing or disagreeing with her. It is presented in a way that's very matter of fact. She quickly takes us through that line of reasoning and makes some valid points. I would love to hear some. I'd love to hear the responding essays, like, like if it was like a series of essays and they're all talking back and forth to each other. I think that would be pretty cool, to really open up this discussion and get to the heart of why we need a female version of Viagra. So, if you have any questions or additional comments at this point, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, we can move on to watch the next video.